Good afternoon. Welcome to Spectrum's Book Club. We invite you to participate with questions and comments on the Zoom chat at any time or on Facebook Live. Make some comments during this 1 hour that we're together. Generally, at about half past the hour, we open the discussion for people on Zoom to unmute and maybe turn on the video and join the conversation. But meanwhile, keep your microphone muted, please. I recognize many faces and names of folks who mean a lot to me and to the Spectrum community. And I wish I could welcome you to book group properly with some fresh peaches and iced tea. I'm Carmen Lau, chair of Adventist Forum. I live in Birmingham, Alabama, where we're having heat, humidity, and a chance of thunderstorms. I'd like to pause a moment before we move on into our discussion. And I just wanted to have a bit of gratitude and reflection before we move on. 1 year ago, Spectrum began a 3-year campaign to raise $1 million in donations and pledges with a fundraising effort that we called Grow the Vision. And we wanted to give Alexander, our new editor, an ample runway, so to speak, to implement the strategic plan put in place by the board. And thanks to many of you, we've raised our Grow the Vision goal of $1 million in about a year instead of 3. So thank you all. And with your generosity, we'll create a better website, host a complete journal archive, hire more journalists, and keep sharing the best in Adventism and beyond. We're growing together. Thank you. Now today, we're honored that Dr. Michael Campbell is our guest to discuss his latest book, 1922, The Rise of Adventist Fundamentalism. Fundamentalism, as he says, may be a loaded term, and he tries to avoid binary discussion, but wants to help the church look both ways, backward and forward, and look at it from many different dimensions. Now, just this summer, he has taken a position as director for North American Division Archives, Statistics and Research. Before that, he was a beloved professor at Southwestern Adventist University in Keene, Texas. He's an ordained Adventist minister, has served in the Philippines at the Adventist International Institute of Advanced Studies. Welcome, Michael. So good to see you. Oh, let me get you to unmute.
Thank you, Carmen, for those kind words. And I'm just delighted to be able to engage with people I consider friends. So thank you.
We also have with us Alexander Carpenter. A big welcome to him. He is now the executive editor of Spectrum magazine and the executive director of Adventist Forum. Alex, thank you for the energy and creativity that you bring to your roles. Welcome.
Thanks. Those are kind words, Carmen, and I'm honored to be with all of you and looking forward to hearing your thoughts on this really great book.
Bonnie Dwyer is editor emerita of Spectrum magazine. And we all know that Bonnie has a gentle way of making conversations softly flow, but really go somewhere. And so we all benefit from her engagement with whatever she chooses to do. And we're glad she's part of this book group. Hi, Bonnie.
Hi, Carmen. Really good to see everyone. It promises to be a really fun conversation today.
So this book, 1922, The Rise of Adventist Fundamentalism, is relatively short book, 150 pages. I managed to mark many pieces of it that showed me historical tidbits, and it was more than just trivia. There seemed to be meaning to each piece that was added in this book. It does focus on North American Adventism, where after World War I, there was a level of paranoia toward parts of society that did not belong to the dominant culture. For example, certain religious groups were minded to take steps to prove patriotism. After
realized that in May of 2018.
Did I Google something? Did I call something or something? I don't know what that was. Sometimes Siri listens. So American Christians were mindful of many impending dangers, the higher criticism that seemed to be coming from Europe, the danger of liberalism, communism, evolution. And so for Adventist leaders, raw from the happenings of the 1919 Bible Conference, these issues seemed big and demanded attention and action. Now, Michael, it seems like just yesterday that you published 1919, and I pulled out my copy of that. And now you've done another evocative work, continuing on the theme of fundamentalism. And I wanted to ask you first, what stimulated you to write this book? And did you know from the beginning that it would come in 2 stages or maybe more?
Yeah, thank you very much. And again, thank you for taking the time to engage with these ideas. When you're a historian, you want to not only find things that are in the historical records, but find things that are hopefully relevant, right? And so 1922 was kind of a natural outgrowth. Way back when I was working in my dissertation on 1919, I remember several of the committee members and my advisor at the time encouraging me to narrow the topic down and just get done. And the words were, you have the rest of your life to keep exploring. So you just need to get finished and then go have fun, basically. So this is my go have fun. So really, the question that drove this was what happened after the 1919 Bible Conference, the aftermath. And so really, this in a way, this was my COVID baby, my COVID project, because you lock up a Adventist historian for during the midst of COVID, and you end up rereading through materials and the review, and what ended up happening was this book. And I found new things, and as I did that, I got really excited. Pacific Press was very gracious about their willingness and interest to publish it. Although I will say that they also said, hey, narrow this down. I probably could have published a book twice this size, but they said, just keep it really focused. And as a result, I have enough material that I think I'm going to end up with 2 more books, one focused specifically on last generation theology, and then another one that's going to look more in depth on Adventist involvement with William Jennings Bryan that leads up to the Scopes trial. And I've already actually started going to the Library of Congress, going through the Bryan papers in preparation for that. So I think I didn't plan on this. I didn't just sit down and say this is kind of how, it's going to be 3 volumes or four volumes, but it's sort of just evolving as I go along, as I find materials. And so it gives me pleasure that this came out in this form, and I hope it's helpful in creating constructive conversations in the church.
Since you brought up William Jennings Bryan, I think I shared with you how I was struck with one of your tidbits in the book, which is that his name was mentioned, did you say 500 times?
I don't remember, but it was a lot.
Over a decade. And
Well,
I just thinking, who else was mentioned that many times in Adventist literature? I mean, that I was just blown away by that.
Yeah, Ellen White appears on the cover a couple of times. She dies in 1915, of course, but I really, of course, a number of pioneers pass away, and their pictures are on the cover, like Butler and Loughborough, when these memorial issues. But it really struck me in going through the review, and it's not the kind of thing you notice unless you just go slowing down and go page by page, is how many times Bryan actually ends up on the cover of Signs or the review. And I think I found a few more times since I actually wrote the book. So there's at least, I think, about 10 or 12 times, something like that he's on the cover of the review or Signs. And so, yeah, it shows that there's an intersect between Adventism and the wider milieu of that time, as Adventists are intersecting with these ideas and engaging them. And Adventists back then are part of their culture. So part of the job of a historian is to reconstruct that so we understand what that is. But Bryan is a huge part of the story. I engage with it a little bit in this, and then I think in a subsequent volume, I'm going to go more in depth. I'm already surprised with some of the material I found. I know others have found some stuff, and I'm finding some more. And again, that's part of what we try to do is uncover the past and tell that story as accurately as we possibly can.
Thank you. And I just had one more question before we hand it off to Bonnie to dialogue with you. But I was going to read your 8 chapters here for maybe those who haven't seen the book. And then I wanted to ask you, if you had 3 or 4 sentence summary that you feel like people need to get from this book, what would that be? Because several of the comments on Amazon and Barnes and Noble say this should be a mandatory book for Adventist pastors. And so I just wondered if you had a chunk of a takeaway, but I'll read your chapters just so that those who haven't seen the book get a flavor of what you cover. 1 is Adventism under siege. 2, muscular Adventism. 3, defending Adventist fundamentalism. 4, Baconian Adventism, the price is right. 5, weaponizing Ellen White. 6, canonizing Ellen White. 7, Adventist fundamentalism. 8, trading places. And I felt like you did such a masterful job, boiling it down to these themes. But what would be your summary of why people should read this book widely?
Yeah, I think really kind of just to succinctly put it together is I think fundamentalism profoundly changed and altered Adventism, and how we understand, how we interpret inspired writings matters a great deal. And so the ways that we've done that and the influences that have helped to shape those kinds of forces in our Adventist past need to be carefully reflected on. And so what I'm trying to do is to unpack that a little bit so that we can, again, my goal is to create conversation spaces that we can talk and better understand our history, which by extension, I think impacts our identity in really significant ways.
Bonnie, what are you thinking?
I'm trying to figure out how to do the Garrison Keillor joke about putting the fun back in fundamentalism. I was going to thank you for doing that, Michael. But maybe I would say thank you for putting the focus on fundamentalism, because I think it really sharpens our conversation about our identity. I wanted to ask you, it's actually, I guess, that last chapter, Trading Places, that's about the 1922 General Conference session. Is that the first session, GC session post E.G. White's death?
No, that will be the second General Conference session. Okay. Can you hear me? Yeah, so 1918 would have been the first one after her death, and then 1922. And interestingly, our family, since we're out here on the West Coast, and this spoke at the Church of the Grove, and Heidi had this early modern conference at PUC. We did pop over to San Francisco, and the original building, this big exposition hall, is still standing next to City Hall. And I think there's been more GC sessions there than any other place outside of maybe Battle Creek, which is kind of interesting. So there's that history, and but yeah, it's the second one after that GC session. Or after Ellen White's death, excuse me.
You talk about how many that you needed to go to quite a number of different sources to feel like you could tell the story. And this GC session is marked by a change in the GC president. It's marked by kind of a split nominating committee that is it takes them a week to figure out who they want to have as president. It's a very dramatic story. And so I was hoping that you could tell us a little bit more about your research into it, and why is it significant that it takes multiple sources? Because it seems like a good story always takes multiple sources, and just thinking that one can just read the review account, kind of short changes us when we think we only need one account?
Yeah, great question. I mean, that's the work of the historian, is to try to really uncover as accurately as possible the past, right? And so when there's more than one perspective, that certainly helps. 22, if you're looking at the history of GC sessions and GC session bulletins, is kind of a slim pickings, where they did have a GC bulletin, and there are some of the reports of the major sessions, but it's not as detailed as the one before and the one after it. So it's sort of a minimalist approach to the GC session itself in terms of how Adventists reported on themselves to the wider church. And I think part of it was controversial.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Is it
Yeah.
because it was so political?
Absolutely. And so you have this thing where you have an outgoing general conference president who has been in leadership for 21 years. Kind of everyone sees the writing on the wall. It's time. 21 years is long enough. But how do you help him have a graceful exit? And there's a strong push. And then part of it also is you have these, I guess, for lack of a better term, dissidents, people that are really attacking, like Claude Holmes and J.S. Washburn, who just are unrelenting. And so if you let Daniels go, it makes it look as if they are capitulating to these strident extreme forces within the church. And so there's this sort of balancing. And then you have the churches become more global, and there's more global interests. So really the answer to this is that it's complicated. And I think that's one of the things as a historian I like to emphasize is that is the complexity of history. And here's one of those aspects where it truly is complex. And so they actually do something to save face. They put in someone new, Spicer, and they take Daniels out, but they still put him in a position of leadership. So Spicer and Daniels swap places. So he saves face, and at the same time, there's a key change in leadership. So, and of course that plays out, and there's letters, there's different kinds of ways that we can kind of see that a little bit. There's the newspaper reports there in the local newspapers reporting on some of the things that are said. So you got to piece all of that together carefully. And that's part of what we do as historians. But I really think right up there with 1888, 1922 is probably, it's at least as controversial as the 1888 General Conference session. And so certainly deserves to have some attention brought to it as probably it is no question, it's one of the most controversial General Conference sessions in our Adventist past.
One of the things that you said was that I think it was A.G. Daniels had the people who were not delegates have a chance to vote after the delegates had made their decision. They allowed the non-delegates to vote. I thought that was amazing.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think there was a sense that after so much controversy, that Spicer was a peacemaking person. And so I think he really was trying to calm the waters of all the agitation. And he was really focused on missionary work and was far less of maybe a theologian kind of thing. And so he's an administrator trying to make peace. And he certainly didn't push himself into that position. You can easily see that from the letter that's in one of the appendices that I put in there. But there he is. And yeah, so he takes that to the floor and just wants to make sure that there's strong affirmation with Daniels and that there's goodwill between the two top leaders of the church. So very controversial, but at the same time, it's hard when you have a GC president that wants to continue serving. That's quite clear. Daniels wanted to continue serving, and yet the church feels that it's time for a change. And so how do you go about doing that in a way that's diplomatic? And Spicer really is able to take a very controversial, intense session, actually ends up being elected, and in the ensuing months after 22 is able to kind of build bridges and move the church forward. I mean, I think this is a much better story of an outcome of the aftermath of a controversial GC session versus 1888, where Ellen White for years afterwards is still kind of trying to mend fences and get people back together and healing wounds from that GC session. So So Spicer really had a gift for bringing people together. But so now I need to write the story of the aftermath, not of 1919, which is what this is, but the aftermath of 22. So that will be my next one after this. Certainly there's much to be said for Spicer's style of leadership. He was not hierarchical. He was very much a person who believes in empowering the church and believed in the mission of the church. And so I think that's part of that story is he felt in order to move forward, he needed to have that vote from the delegates from the floor. That's hard when you're in the midst of when there's split votes and there's hard feelings. But he was wise enough to realize that he didn't want the position until he had that vote.
Thank you.
So that's probably a long answer to that, a simple question, but a lot of drama there.
Yes. And you portrayed it well.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, the GC session was riveting, and I read this before I went to the last GC session, so it was really great to have a sense of what being in the room and the nominating committee felt like. So thanks. Is it my shot to ask the historian a question? Great. Number one, thanks for bringing more dates into the Adventist lexicon. I was joking around with a scholar that, half the Adventist passwords for their laptops have some variation of 1844, and now, at least that's true in the Spectrum office. I don't want to give away any secrets here, but now we can update our passwords as our IT professionals tell us, and we'll string together, some more current dates. So I'm loving it. I have a question on the rise of the use of the term fundamentalism in Adventism right now. After reading your book, I read Gil Valentine's, who works at length to really define it and get away with it. And I will be publishing a contrarian take from historian Eric Anderson in the upcoming issue of the Journal, which calls for a moratorium on the word fundamentalism. So I'm giving you a chance to pre-butt that here and talk about why, as a scholar, you feel that it's a helpful term. And just to, I always like to give, read some of our author's words here, since I know they labor so much over them. So here in the epilogue, page 113, you write, "Yet if Adventist history in the 20th century is any indication, especially in the period covered in this book," nice qualifier, "the temptation to a rigid conservatism seems to be the more common peril the church faces." I wouldn't, there's more context that you give to that, but since you're here, I'd love to hear your context for using the word fundamentalism.
Yeah, absolutely. Great question, Alexander. And, no term is perfect, right? So, and so that's why it's very important to define terms, because fundamentalism certainly has a lot of baggage with it. You have fundamentalist terrorists, in the Middle East or whatever, and people use that term. And so, yeah, it can become loaded, but I think it's hard to get away from the fact that there was a historical fundamentalist movement. And it's hard to say that there was fundamentalism in the 19th century, because fundamentalism as a reaction to modernism didn't exist. And so I always qualify this in my books, and I try to when I speak publicly on this, that it's really important to define your terms. And so I'm a historian, so I'm defining it in a historical sense. And I know even Gil, I think in that book, kind of quotes me or references me towards the beginning, and he likes to see fundamentalism as something originating out of Adventism from the beginning kind of thing. I don't see it that way. I know if you just take fundamentalism in terms of the ideas of inspiration, there's a longer history there. But I don't see, it's anachronistic in my viewpoint to say fundamentalism was fundamentalism before there was fundamentalism, right? And so I'm talking about a distinctive historical movement. And when there is a distinctive historical movement, there's hundreds of books, thousands of articles written by scholars about the historical modernist fundamentalist controversy. It's hard to say, well, let's use a better term when that's the terminology. All the scholarship is done and uses that terminology. What is not helpful, I think, is when people start putting labels and, you're a fundamentalist in some kind of mean or derogatory kind of way. And I don't mean it that way at all. I'm just trying to be a good historian, I hope, and say, hey, here's a historical movement that actually happened. Here's when it happened, the early 20th century. Yeah, there's some antecedents and everything else to it and the historical context. And by the way, here's how it influenced Adventism. And Adventists embraced the terminology through the 1920s. It's quite clear to me as I keep working in the 1920s, and will show, I think, in some of my subsequent work that I've been working on, that Adventists are emphatic in saying that we are the true fundamentalists, or my favorite terminology is the fundamentalists of the fundamentalists, right? So we're the sort of purebred version of fundamentalism. So for lack of a better term, if you're going to say, well, let's not use the term fundamentalist. Now, I will agree, I think a moratorium might be necessary if people are name calling. That's not nice. That's not constructive. But my research, what I hope to do is talk about the past and in some ways that are constructive. And you may not like the terminology, you may not like the fact that this happened, but I can't change the past. I only describe the past. And so I find this useful because the wider world of scholarship, this is what everyone uses. It's the terminology that our Adventists 100 years ago used themselves. So I just would preface it and say, hey, let's use this in constructive ways, and let's study the past. Let's not avoid it or ignore it. And I can't think of a better term to be able to describe fundamentalism than the term they use themselves. So that is what it is.
Yes, I love a good historian defining terms and helping us understand how we can use them in our contemporary time as well.
There's a quote about in your epilogue, Michael, from William Branson, who became GC president. And he says, the church needs men who are fundamentalists to the core and who know how to preach Christ and him crucified. So it was how they described themselves. You're right.
I love this definition of terms and looking at the different contexts and how they use the terms. And it just struck me as we were talking just now, the phrase weaponizing Ellen White or weaponizing your faith, and this verb weaponizing. And I have just taken it to be a negative term. But I wonder, would some people think that's a positive term? Like, would that have been something to do? Of course, we have the faith and we will weaponize it. I don't know. What do you think about that? And do you automatically think it's negative? If so, what might be some steps to remedy it? Or could it have been a positive thing for some people in some context to, instead of fighting a war, we're just going to weaponize our faith, or using Ellen White? I just wondered what you thought of that, Michael.
Yeah, so, a weapon is only a weapon if it's used in a way that takes somebody out. So it's very militaristic language, right? So what's just happened, World War I. So people are very concerned about how they define their faith. And so this is what's going on. And I think it's dangerous if we start putting motives on people, why they were doing certain things. I think it's clear that they felt that their faith was, and that's my beginning chapter, was under siege, and people feel threatened. When people feel threatened, they do things that they might not ordinarily do. And I think that's part of the impulse of fundamentalism theologically, is we need to preserve the faith in a world that is rapidly changing or eroding around them. And so as they're doing that, there's a tendency to use it, I think most often, and maybe this may just reflect my own experience, I don't know, but yeah, I've been on the receiving end of where people have used Ellen White quotes to bash them over my head on certain things. And I was talking to a pastor friend. His mom was literally beaten with Ellen White's books, with red books. I mean, so she can't look at a red book, an Ellen White book, without it actually bringing out all of these emotions within, right? So now that's very extreme, and I hope she's a very rare instance, but you know, there is a temptation for religious or spiritual abuse, and that happens in many forms in many different places. I do think there's a greater temptation of that in an environment where it's very rigid, very focused on perfectionism, very focused on proof texting, and that kind of thing. So I think more often than not, it does tend to be some way harmful, but that may not reflect everyone's experience. And I can't say, because there's so many other different perspectives, but I can say in my own experience, I've seen where weaponizing was actually very hurtful and maybe I would say even damaging. So, but my thing is not to just come after that and say, oh, well, then all the fundamentalism's bad and, you know, it's a bad term or anything like that. I tend to look at history as more nuanced, more complex. And, you know, fundamentalism is, Adventism and fundamentalism intersected. One area where I see some positivity is the fundamentalists were very strong about the need to emphasize the Trinity. And definitely you see a strong connection between fundamentalist authors being quoted and referenced, and the Adventists are emphasizing they believe in the Trinity in the 1920s to show and prove that they're fundamentalists. So in a way, fundamentalism can be credited to helping push Adventism towards a full embrace of the Trinity. I see that Larry's on here. You know, Adventists are going to archaeological dig sites. The earliest I found now is 1913. And through the 1920s, there's a strong interest in Adventist archaeology. And that pulse to move, obviously others like Siegfried Horn and other, later will develop that in a more professional sense. But that strong interest in archaeology, I think in many ways can be traced in the 1920s with archaeological discoveries and the need to vindicate the inspiration and perhaps for some would say the inerrancy of Scripture. Now, that will temper, and it's a complicated story after that, the history of Adventist archaeology, but there is that initial connection that's there, the need to show that the Bible is truly inspired. And so these are areas that will bear rich fruit in very different ways. So that's why I say that history is complex and the story of Adventism and fundamentalism is complex. So when I say Adventism and fundamentalism intersected, I'm not saying in some pejorative kind of way. I'm trying to be honestly as accurate and descriptive as I possibly can. But yes, it came with some baggage, and that inerrant views of inspiration and so on will have a lot of complications for how we understand and use Ellen White and how we view the inspiration of the Bible and so on. So yeah, it's not an easy answer to answer that, but hopefully that's a little bit helpful.
Thank you. We are at the time when we welcome questions and comments from those who are on Zoom with us. If you want to speak up, just raise your hand or type something in the chat and maybe Alex will read it for us. Have you seen any comments, Alex, that you want to share on Facebook or from some of the people here on Zoom?
We've got some comments coming in on Facebook, and I see some people turn their camera on, so I think we've got some questioners ready to go. I just put a poll up, and I thought I'd share that here, and if people want to put their hands up if they'd like to ask a question or make a comment, go ahead and do that now. I just asked if you've already read the book, or yes, no, or if you have it but haven't read it yet, and we have 23% of our audience here has read the book, 58% has not yet, and 19% have the book but haven't read it yet. So looks like we could make some sales here for you.
All right. Well, Adventist authors aren't known for making money on their books, but it is always gratifying if people read them. So I'm grateful for the interest.
Yes, thank you for toiling in the vineyard here and writing Adventist history. All right, questions, comments?
I don't want to miss anyone because we have
I see Andrew.
Oh, good.
Yeah,
All right.
hi. Greetings from Australia. It's quite early in the morning here.
Wow.
It's great to join you guys. Yeah, thanks for your book. I'm one of those who's still reading it. It only just arrived in Australia. The mail's a bit slow at the moment with COVID. But I'm just wondering about the figures, Washburn and B.G. Wilkinson. These seem like quite aggressive politicking fellows. And, you know, I'd never heard much about them until recent years. Maybe you could comment a bit about the influence of these guys.
Yeah, so Holmes and Washburn and, well, Wilkinson for that matter too. You know, Wilkinson was interesting. He spoke at the 1919 Bible Conference, but his transcripts got separated and turned up in the Center for Adventist Research. And how that happened, I still have no idea. But if you look through the minutes, they look like they've been rifled through. There's notes here and there that certain people took sections of it. So they were obviously, some people were accessing them, and there's portions of them that were published later on as well. So people were familiar with these materials, at least somewhat. Holmes and Washburn were just convinced that our church leaders were up to no good and were in a conspiracy. And so I've pointed out in my work here how Washburn and Holmes basically went to the GC president. We've got all these damaging letters by Ellen White admonishing you, and if you don't resign, we'll basically publish them. And so trying to take out the GC president, and he's like, "You're fired." So they were done. And two of the most caustic individuals in all of Adventist history. It's really difficult to underestimate just how. I'm shocked even today, you know, looking back at some of the material. In fact, the daughter of, I think it was Holmes, actually wrote an apology letter after her father died. So she felt so bad that at the way her father had treated the church leaders. So that's what's going on. They feel it's in the name of truth and the conquest of truth to protect the church and to do what they believed was right. They were willing to maybe descend to sort of this muckraking kind of techniques and whatever it took so that they could hopefully get their way. Unfortunately, what that ended up doing was showing people kind of the true spirit of what they were. And so even the people that may have supported them theologically, that were quite conservative, even in church leadership, found it very hard to actually support them. So you have letters by W.C. White, the son of Ellen White, admonishing them, you know, basically, you know, we see you kind of have a point. I'm kind of summarizing my own words, but we don't like your spirit. We don't like the way you're doing these things, right? And so they were just so caustic that I think it undermined a lot of what they're doing. But yeah, you can look later on in the 20th century, you find others that point to Washburn and Holmes as their theological heroes. Probably the most recent ones would have been in the 80s and 90s. Wieland, in short, they looked to Washburn and Holmes as sort of spiritual heroes for them and some of their ideas. So you see how some of these ideas have a history and that percolates on. But yeah, it's really a sad chapter in our Adventist past. And of course, some people are quite intrigued by the whole Wilkinson taking out some of the religion history teachers there with the whole Jesuit conspiracy things, which that has a whole history. Someone needs to write a history of Jesuit conspiracy theories in Adventist history. That'd be a fun article to write, because that's certainly not the only one.
Thank you. Larry Garrity, I see your hand is up.
I don't know if it'd be fair to ask you to tell us a little bit about your new job and what you've found as you've moved to NAD, and especially as to its relationship to what the GC is doing along similar lines? Is there a cooperative endeavor? Is it something that's completely separate? And what are your plans?
Yeah, thanks, Larry. Always good to see you. And yeah, I think, kind of feeling my way into this. It's a new role. I've only been in this role for just about 2 months, and I'm excited. I'm excited to see what our church leaders are doing, and then the vision to see cultivating the best of Adventist research, and that includes historical awareness and preserving and promoting our Adventist past. And so I've sensed really strong support from our church leaders that we want to do that. We're not trying to create and duplicate an archive. We're not trying to create the Center for Adventist Research, or down the road, we've got the General Conference archives, but we're trying to look at ways that we can fill the gaps and what are the things that are being overlooked. So one example of something that I'm trying to strongly encourage is the oral history program, so we can preserve stories of people. And we need to do a better job at that. So I see my role as something that's supportive. Certainly we've got other endeavors, but to look across North America, make sure that we're preserving, promoting our past. And then in terms of research and statistics, to cultivate the best research, the best conferences, and help support those researchers. I believe the best scholarship is collaborative. So we want to create atmospheres, environments for collaborative kinds of research, and to support that. So again, I'm thankful that I see our NAD leadership strongly supporting that, and of course we're a division of the General Conference. We're the North American division, which means that obviously we have a General Conference archive, statistics, and research. So certainly we want to support whatever David Trim and the rest of his team. They've been most gracious and welcoming, and look forward to any ways that I can support them as well. But my role is specifically for the North American division, and I report to the North American division. So I want to see what we can do. I kind of like to see our department become sort of like a George Barna, a center. What's the best research? So we understand Adventism and the trends, so that church leaders at all levels of the church in North America can make informed decisions that will help to benefit the mission of the church. So that's in a nutshell a little bit of my what I hope that will develop. And so I'm really excited to be a part of it, and feel it's a great privilege.
Thank you.
I see we have a comment from Jody. How did fundamentalism affect the role of women in the Adventist Church?
Yeah, I have a whole chapter. Now you need to read my book, Jody, and I have a whole chapter titled Muscular Adventism. And I think this is yeah, that's right. Thanks, Carmen. What does that look like? And what really surprised me was an article I read that I reference in the chapter, and to this whole, who is the perfect ideal model Adventist? And I thought it'd be James White, or maybe go back to Martin Luther. And instead it was Teddy Roosevelt. And all of this verbiage of the more muscular and masculine you are, the more spiritual you are. And so I was really shocked to find this. And I had a historian friend that read my book, and then he looked up all my sources there, and he said, Michael, you were very kind. It's actually much stronger language when you go back and read all the original articles. So yeah, it changed Adventism in profound ways. I argue fundamentalism changed Adventism both in terms of race and gender. And that chapter looks specifically at gender. And, by 1910, there's about 1,000 women in the church in various positions as pastors and influential positions. And by 1930, there's virtually none. So how do you explain that except through fundamentalism? And I don't want to give my whole book or chapter away there, but read the chapter, and you can check my sources there. But I think it's quite clear that at least fundamentalism contributed in no small way to changing expectations of gender roles.
Well, we, our book club, when we were meeting on Friday, read Jesus and John Wayne, and I can't remember who discussed that with us. Maybe, was it you, Greg? Were you with us? Yeah. And it almost sounds like we as Adventists were doing it ahead of time with Teddy Roosevelt. It could have been Jesus and Teddy Roosevelt, we were kind of turning into that muscular Christianity. But yeah. Okay, I see a hand up. Yes. Greg Schneider. Oh, clapping. Okay.
Actually, no, that's a hand up. I hit the wrong thing. I was intending.
Okay.
I'm happy to clap also.
Yes. Okay.
I will just complicate that whole picture of gender a little bit. I think an important part of a kind of general cultural shift, popular cultural shift in American culture, particularly middle-class American culture in the late 19th century, came with what some historians have called the incorporation of American culture, and the rise of the corporation, the rise of the formal organization, and hierarchies of authority, and the proliferation of job posts that required a certain degree of professionalization. What's famous about Adventism in 1901 and the rise of A.G. Daniels was the incorporation of Adventist organized efforts, and it's following a formal organization, management policy, and that sort of thing. It seems to be a pretty strong correlation that the incorporation of American culture also resulted in the pushing of women out of positions of influence and public significance, and their replacement by men. So I think the incorporation of American culture and Adventist life in particular is probably another dimension of the process that you're describing between 1910 and 1930, quite apart from Adventist fundamentalism. I think that whole muscular Christianity kind of thing, you find that as much as among liberals as you do among fundamentalists.
Yeah,
so it's
absolutely.
kind of a double whammy.
Yeah, you make a great point, Greg. I couldn't agree more that, I tend to use the term bureaucratization, right? In the 20s is just famous for that. And Adventism, you see following these same kinds of models. You have these departments and all of these processes. The ministerial department, the General Conference is created during the 1920s with this specific purpose of professionalizing Adventist clergy, so that there's an actual system and accountability and hiring process, so that that resembles a large corporation in many respects. So, Greg, I'd say you're spot on. I agree with you fully. I've tried to at least provide a little bit of context about that in my book, but I certainly could do more because I agree with you. That's a very important social, cultural, historical background to this whole 1920s.
And another part of that that complicates the whole fundamentalist but modernist opposition is the bureaucratization. I'm perfectly comfortable with that word too: bureaucratization, professionalization,
yeah,
formal organization. It's the liberals, it's the modernists that are the main promoters of those kinds of trends. And part of what sociologically one would define as modernity is exactly that formal organization of society.
Yeah, I agree. I've tried to highlight that in my definitions towards the beginning, because I would argue that the modernists and the fundamentalists are equally influenced by the rising sensibilities of modernism and various assumptions that go with that. But I agree, Greg. Great.
Very good.
We've got the PUC faculty are really showing up today here. We've got a question from Brian Ness on Facebook, and he asks, does the broader evangelical world feel a sense that the term fundamentalist is pejorative today, or are they enthusiastic about embracing the name? I feel it odd that conservative SDAs once called themselves fundamentalists, but now seem to not like the term.
Yeah, I don't know, because their terminologies change over time again, right? So what is popular in one era may not be popular in another era. We tend to not use the term fundamentalist, at least not as much. I think it's fallen out of disfavor after September 11, because of Islamic fundamentalism. So people want to disassociate from that kind of terminology. But Martin Marty and the University of Chicago did an extensive project on fundamentalisms across various world religions and cultures. And so it certainly is quite pervasive, and it's the wide repertoire of scholarship. Usually the term is kind of, and this is what makes it confusing, right, is that a fundamentalist is a kind of a militant evangelical, at least historically at the early 20th century. But the term that really is becoming in vogue is evangelical, once again, for what we would probably historically have called a fundamentalist. And so we're starting to see that, and that creates confusion, right, in terms of terms. But the Christian nationalism that you see described, especially in a American context, usually evangelical has become very normative in that respect. But it's difficult, and that's why it's really important to define our terms, what you mean, and when you're describing it. But as a historian, I think that it is still a useful term, especially when describing the specific modernist fundamentalist riff and trying to understand that historical context. So again, I realize it's a problematic term, but that's why I try to define my terms.
Did we have a follow-up, Greg? Oh, yes, right here.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Greg, do you mind if I go to Ciro?
Oh, please do.
He hasn't spoken yet. Yes, go ahead. I may not have pronounced your name correctly. Forgive me.
That's fine. I know that at the beginning of the 20th century, there are a lot of Adventists, and I'm thinking specifically of John Harvey Kellogg, that are supportive of eugenics. This science that really becomes popular, or pseudoscience that becomes popular, and there are dozens of departments in colleges and universities that create or found these departments. And I'm wondering if, as you've studied this time period, are there Adventists that fall in line with that type of thinking?
Yeah, Ciro, good to see you. And that's a great question. Obviously, by the time Kellogg really gets into eugenics, he's long left Adventism. I haven't extensively studied that thoroughly enough to be able to say definitively whether, how extensive, if any, influence there was in the eugenics movement. Obviously, Kellogg, like I said, is long gone out of the picture. He's very prominent in the eugenics movement. I have looked at Kellogg's eugenics literature, and I don't see any Adventists who are still Adventist who are helping him. So, and there could be somebody that I just have missed or not seen, but at least in terms of the popular mainstream eugenics movement through the 20s, and again, I want to couch that I haven't studied this extensively, but from what I've seen, I don't see Adventists embracing that as strongly as, say, the Ku Klux Klan, where I've actually found a number of examples. Again, not all Adventists in the 1920s embraced the Ku Klux Klan either, but at least I have found, much to my chagrin, some examples of that. And so hence, we need to wrestle with and understand and make sense of these kinds of things. But it could be, Ciro, that's probably worthy of a much more in-depth research project. But there's certainly no articles in the review in the 1920s, which I have read, the 1920s review cover to cover. And I have not seen anything, any reference to eugenics there. So it wasn't in the main, which would be in contrast to fundamentalism, where you see the term fundamentalist or fundamentalism being used on the front cover of the review on a pretty regular basis by way of contrast.
Thank you.
Thank you. I will take your follow-up, Greg, and then there's a question in the chat and we'll wrap it up.
Sure. Just the story of fundamentalism versus evangelicalism that I was taught, in part by Martin Marty, who was one of my teachers, was that fundamentalism ran into public disrepute after the Scopes trial, and H.L. Mencken and the ridicule of fundamentalists in that context. And so fundamentalism still was a label that people proudly carried, but it was a pretty marginal movement that did so. And then there was the revival of conservative evangelicalism under the banner of evangelicalism, under the leadership of the Christianity Today, Carl Henry, and Billy Graham, and that sort of stuff. And so that was the respectable evangelical Protestantism that questions on doctrine tried to engage and tried to persuade them that we were not a cult. And that evangelicalism was kind of the leading edge of conservative Protestantism into the 1970s, with fundamentalism still a vocal minority, but almost priding themselves in being a minority. And then in the 70s, things begin to change with the rise of the politicization of evangelicalism and the moral majority and James Dobson and focus on the family and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So there's still American evangelical Protestants who would be fine with the label of fundamentalism, but it doesn't have the same cachet that it did in its peak that you trace in the 1920s. So in answer to Brian's question, again, invoking your good historian's instinct, it's complicated.
It is. It's complicated because the fundamentalists and evangelicals split in the 50s, as you pointed out. And you have this more moderate branch with Billy Graham, and Adventists love Billy Graham. In the 50s, they gravitate, and all you have to do is search for Billy Graham's name in the review. And that would make a great study in itself too, right? And you can see that gravitational push in that direction. But you're right, it ebbs and flows over the decades. But I'm trying to stick to the 20s because I think it's a great starting point, but there's so much work that needs to be done in 20th century Adventism.
And then the last question, Michael, is here in the comments on Zoom. Was the rise in fundamentalism unique to the Adventist Church in the early 20th century? Help us understand that context a little bit.
Absolutely not unique whatsoever. When I was, I had the privilege while I was doing my doctoral studies, I went down and sat in a seminar by George Marsden, and the seminar is made up of people of all different faiths, right? There was a Anabaptist, there was somebody from a whole host of different traditions. We're all from different traditions, which made for lively seminar discussions, right? And many of those have gone on to publish articles and books because it's been almost 20 years now. And if you look in the wider field of literature, you'll see that fundamentalism impacted pretty much all denominations. Now, there was two different kinds of reactions. Some denominations split, right? Some in a modernist fundamentalist trajectory. Others took would go either all modernist or all fundamentalist. And Adventism goes all fundamentalist, but there's two different varieties of fundamentalism, if you please, a more moderate form and then a more strident form. And that's the kind of parallel that we see within Adventism. Someone wrote actually a really good book on a dissertation on the Advent Christian Church and fundamentalism. And there's another example of a church that's split, where you had the schools, the colleges that went more modernist and that eventually have to be kind of reined in, and then the wider church that gravitates more towards fundamentalism. But there's, again, that split kind of thing. No one's saying that Adventism should become modernist. I have yet to find that in the literature in the 20s and anywhere in Adventism. No one says modernism is a good thing. Everyone, including the most progressive Adventists, are saying we are fundamentalists. And so there you have it.
Thank you. We have almost completed our hour together. It's just whizzed by. And I, have asked Bonnie and Alex to share a favorite passage from your book. So just sit back and enjoy how we love your writing, Michael. So they're going to do that, and then we'll wrap up and say farewell. And so, yes, Bonnie, you first.
Well, going to a short quote rather than a longer one, fundamentalism is a good thing, if not militant, was a quote from, I think, Spicer after the 1922 GC. So fundamentalism had two sides, obviously.
It's been great. Thank you so much. We've about, including our Facebook audience, we've had over 60 people joining us for this. So it's a riveting topic, and we won't have to answer this question, but Dean Waterman asked a question about what are the lessons to learn 100 years later. It's obviously 2022 now. So I thought perhaps you help us on page 60. This is not one of your most poetic sentences, but perhaps prophetic or profound for us today. No person was more influential for Adventist fundamentalism, guess who he says, than George McCready Price. Incredible, provocative even. So I thought that's really helpful because you see it at the GC session. Who got prime spots? Folks talking about a literalist understanding of Genesis 1 and 2, extreme literalist. And, that is probably a lesson we haven't learned from our forebears in 1922.
Thank you both. And thank you, Michael Campbell, for your work and for being with us. I feel like this is a beloved community, and what can bring us together is listening to each other and focusing on beauty. Someone said beauty will save the world, and we have disagreements, but we can many times, maybe all the time, agree on what's beautiful. And so thank you all for joining and for supporting Spectrum and Adventist Forum. If you haven't purchased his book, please buy this for Michael Campbell as a token of gratitude for his work, so we can support him in his endeavors. And please mark your calendar for the next book club, which will be August 27, the same time. And we'll have as our guest, Dr. Gil Valentine, to discuss his book, Ostriches and Canaries. And this really is looking at coping with change in Adventism from 1966 to 1979. So we're jumping ahead from what Michael has researched. But thank you all, and mark your calendars, and safe travels to you, Michael, and your precious family.
Thank you again for having me.
Goodbye, everyone. Thank you.
Goodbye.